She didn't come back for him. She came to collect what he owed her. 10 months ago, Nina Vasek walked out of the most powerful private equity front in Chicago with nothing but a duffel bag, a fake ID she'd bought off a paralegal in Wicker Park, and the knowledge that the man she'd been sharing a bed with for 2 years had just survived a car bomb by 11 minutes. Today, she was standing at the iron service entrance of Wolfe's North Shore compound with a certified debt ledger, a manila folder stamped Final Nowater, and a pregnancy she could no longer hide under a winter coat. The guard who stepped out of the booth was new. He had the flat, watchful eyes of someone hired after the bloodletting, after the Del Vecchio hit that had hollowed out half of Wolfe's security rotation last spring. He looked at her face, then his gaze dropped. "Service entrance is for vendors," he said. His voice had lost its authority somewhere between her face and her stomach. Nina pulled a business card from her coat pocket, the name of the organization's internal auditing shell, the one she'd run for 2 years before she ran. "Tell Wolfe that his former accounts manager is at the gate. Tell him her name is Nina Vasek. Tell him she has the final debt ledger he owes her a signature on." She paused. "And tell him she'd appreciate it if he didn't make her stand in the cold." The guard pressed his earpiece, turned away, his shoulders went rigid. Nina waited. The Lake Michigan wind cut through her wool coat like it was tissue paper. She pressed her palm against the underside of her stomach, a habit she'd developed somewhere around month 6, steadying the low, dragging weight that had become the gravitational center of her entire existence. 8 months, 3 weeks. The baby was riding high today, pressing against her ribs with every breath like a reminder, "You can't run anymore. You can't afford to." The gate clicked, swung open. "Mr. Wolfe will see you," the guard said. He still wasn't looking at her stomach. She walked up the long stone path alone. Wolfe's estate sat at the edge of a bluff overlooking the lake. In the 2 years she'd worked inside it, first as a contract auditor, then as something else entirely, something that didn't have a clean title in anyone's org chart, Nina had come to understand the house the way you come to understand any system you're responsible for balancing. She knew where the weight was. She knew where the deficits were hidden. She knew where every camera was pointed. She kept her face neutral as she walked up the front steps. Stig was waiting on the porch. Wolfe's second, a quiet, methodical man who had spent 15 years ironing out the organization's logistics with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed the math of large problems, stood with his arms at his sides and his face entirely blank. She had always liked Stig. He was one of those rare men in Wolfe's orbit who treated her like a functional human being rather than a liability or an asset. He'd taught her where the good coffee was kept and warned her, quietly in her first week, that the third-floor office had a listening device behind the painting of the harbor. Now he was staring at her like she'd materialized out of a crack in the pavement. "Nina," he said, just her name, like a question he couldn't finish. "Stig." She grabbed the railing and hauled herself up the last step. Her lower back had been a grinding, constant ache since Evanston. "Is he in the office?" "Nina," his voice dropped. "What is?" "I have the final ledger. I need 20 minutes and his signature on page 3. She looked at him steadily. "Is he in the office?" Stig stepped aside and opened the door. The house smelled the same. That was the thing that hit her first, before anything else. Cedar from the fireplace, the faint underlayer of gunmetal and fresh-cut paper that clung to every room where serious business happened. And underneath both, something she had no name for, just the particular atmospheric weight of a house that belonged to a man who owned things absolutely. Her stomach tightened, not a contraction, just her body remembering where it was. "He's in the study," Stig murmured behind her. "Nina, he doesn't know." "I know he doesn't." She shifted the manila folder under her arm. "I know." She walked the length of the hall without waiting for an escort. She'd memorized the layout in her first week and never forgot it. Past the framed shipping maps, past the glass cabinet with the old ledgers going back 4 generations of Wolfes, past the door that opened to the garden where she used to stand on Wednesday mornings with her coffee, watching the lake go grey or silver depending on the weather. She stopped at the study door. Dark oak, no window. She could hear the low sound of a voice inside. Dictation. He always dictated his correspondence in the afternoon. He'd told her once that he hated the way his own handwriting looked on paper. She had never admitted that she'd found that a strangely honest thing for a man like him to say. She opened the door. "Reroute the Kenosha shipment by Thursday or I'll replace the entire logistics chain, starting with." Wolfe stopped. He was standing behind his desk, not sitting. He'd always preferred to work standing when he was dictating. Dark charcoal shirt, no jacket, sleeves pushed to the elbows. The recorder sat on the edge of the desk. His reading glasses were pushed up on his head. She'd never told him, in 2 years, that she found that particular detail absurd given everything else he was. He was 42. He looked it now in a way he hadn't when she'd left. New lines around his eyes, his jaw sharper. He'd lost weight he hadn't needed to lose. His eyes went to her face first. She watched the recognition hit, not gradual but instant, like a circuit completing. Then his gaze dropped. The room changed. It was a physical thing, the way the air shifted. Wolfe's expression, always a controlled topography of precisely nothing, underwent something catastrophic. The control didn't slip. It broke. His eyes moved from her stomach back to her face, and then back to her stomach, as if he was running the calculation twice, and getting the same impossible answer both times. His right hand moved to grip the edge of the desk. "Get out," he said. It took Nina a half-second to realize he wasn't talking to her. The assistant who had been seated in the corner scrambled to his feet, knocked his chair into the wall, and was gone before Wolfe finished the sentence. The door pulled shut. Wolfe didn't move. He stood behind his desk, with his hand white-knuckled on the mahogany edge, his eyes fixed on her with the focused, unblinking attention of a man who was very good at not reacting to things, and was currently failing completely. Nina set the folder on the side table by the door. She kept her voice level. "I'm here for the final audit settlement. You owe the consulting firm, which is legally still mine until the dissolution is filed. 14 months of retainer fees that were never paid out after I left. The total is on page 1. It's a fair number. I had an independent CPA run it." She paused. "I need your signature on page 3. Then I'll go." Wolfe said nothing. His eyes moved back to her face. "How long?" he said. She knew what he was asking. 8 months, nearly 9. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the lake wind against the study windows and the distant muffled click of the security system cycling through its rotation. "Sit down," he said, not the voice he used in meetings or on phone calls or when he was explaining to people what would happen if they disappointed him. Something else, stripped of all the architecture. "I don't need to." "Nina." He said her name the way Stig had, like a question but lower. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from his desk, because her back had been screaming since Evanston, and she was 8 months pregnant, and there was no version of pride that was worth more than getting off her feet. Wolfe came around the desk. He didn't sit. He stood in front of her and looked at her from that distance. Close enough that she could see the new grey threaded through the dark at his temples. And he looked at her, the way he looked at a ledger entry that had reappeared on the wrong side of the column, and he was trying to understand how the math worked. "Whose is it?" he said, flat, not quite a question. Nina looked at him steadily. "Are you actually asking me that?" Something moved across his face. "Mine," he said, not a question. This time, just the word falling into the room like something dropped from a height. "It's mine." "Yes." He turned away from her. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room, both hands shoved into his pockets, staring out at the grey November lake. "You left," he said. "Yes." "You found out and you left." "Yes." "Why?" The word came out jagged, like something that hadn't been meant to come out at all. Nina looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked at the back of his shoulders. The rigid, held-together posture of a man who was not going to turn around until he had himself under control. She thought about what she had rehearsed on the train from the city. She thought about the 3 different versions of this conversation she'd staged in the bathroom of her rental in Logan Square, alone at 2 in the morning, with her hands pressed flat to the sides of her stomach. None of those versions had included him asking why in that voice. "The parking garage," she said, "the Monday before I left." He stilled. "You came home at 4 in the morning with glass in your jacket and a burn along your forearm that you told me was a kitchen accident." She kept her voice even. "I pulled the incident report myself the next morning. It wasn't a kitchen accident. It was a fire device planted under the floorboard of your car in the parking structure on Erie Street. The report said the detonation window was 7:45 p.m. She paused. "I had borrowed your car that night. I came back at 7:30. Wolfe went very still. "I missed it by 15 minutes, Nina said. She had not cried about this in 4 months. She wasn't going to cry about it now. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm and breathed through it. "I found out I was pregnant 11 days before that. I hadn't told you yet. I'd bought this pair of socks at a shop on Michigan Avenue. The kind with little yellow ducks on them, which is a ridiculous thing to buy when you don't know anything yet. But I bought them anyway, and I had them in the nightstand drawer." She stopped. "After the garage, I sat with those socks in my hands for 2 hours. And I understood something. If your enemies were willing to put a device under your car, and I was someone they knew about, someone they could use, then a baby wasn't collateral. A baby was the primary target. A baby was how they would break you." The room held the silence for a long time. "So I left," she said, "not because I wanted to, because I couldn't think of a single other option that kept the baby alive." Wolfe turned around. She had seen him in many states over 2 years, cold, methodical, furious in the quiet way that was worse than shouting. She had seen him once, at 3 in the morning in the kitchen, sitting on the counter eating cereal out of the box with all the lights off, and she had thought then that nobody who ever sat across from him in a negotiation would believe that version of him existed. She had not seen this version. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself level with her. She wasn't ready for that, for him to come down to her height. He reached out, slowly, and put both hands on either side of her stomach. She grabbed his wrists, reflex. He didn't move. Just waited, patient in the particular way of someone who understood that certain things could not be rushed. She let go. "I spent 10 months looking for you," he said quietly. "I know." "The Delvecchios are dead." His thumbs pressed gently against the fabric of her sweater. "Every man involved in the garage. I had names by February. It was finished by March." He paused. "The city has been quiet for 5 months." Something in her chest cracked along a seam she hadn't known was there. She didn't answer right away. She was trying to catalogue the pressure of his hands, large, careful, warm through the fabric, and the way the baby had gone utterly still, as if listening. Then the baby kicked. Sharp, definitive, rolling under his left palm. Wolfe's breath stopped. He stared at his own hand. His eyes went soft in a way that had no business happening on a face that looked like his. The expression lasted only a few seconds before something self-conscious moved through him, and he tried to put the architecture back, but she'd seen it. She'd seen the whole unguarded thing. "That's," he started. "Yes," she said. He held very still, waiting. A second kick, lower and slower, like the baby was settling in. When he looked back up at her face, something in his expression was open in a way she couldn't remember seeing before, like a room with all the furniture moved out of it. "You're not leaving tonight," he said. She opened her mouth. "I'm not asking." His voice was quiet, not hard. "The Delvecchios are gone. There is no active threat. You are 8 months pregnant." He paused. He seemed to be doing math in his head about what 14 months of unpaid retainer had actually been covering. "You came here because you've run out of money. That's the real reason." She didn't answer. "That's fine," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply, because it didn't sound fine. It sounded like a man setting something aside to deal with methodically after the immediate problem was addressed. We'll get to that. First, Faris is going to see you. I don't need. When did you last see a doctor? The silence answered for him. The line of his jaw tightened. He stood up and picked up his phone. Stig, his voice shifted to the other register, the one that ran the city. Get Faris to the estate. Portable unit. Yes, now. He paused. Because I said so. He hung up and looked at her. She was still sitting in the chair, with the folder on the side table, and her hands folded in her lap. And she was looking at him with the expression she recognized in herself as the one she wore when she'd completely run out of the energy required to argue. The East Room, he said. It's been empty. You'll stay there. I'm not staying. You came by cab. It's 30 degrees. He said it without inflection. You're staying. He walked to the door and opened it. Stig was in the hallway. Of course he was, wearing the expression of a man who had been listening through solid oak and felt only passing guilt about it. East Room, Wolfe said, and tell Muriel to bring something up from the kitchen. He glanced back at Nina. What do you want? She stared at him. Food, he clarified, patient. What do you want to eat? Anything warm, she said, because she was exhausted and she hadn't eaten since the granola bar on the train, and the baby was doing slow barrel rolls against her ribs. Anything warm, Wolfe repeated to Stig, as if this were a perfectly normal order to give. Stig disappeared. Wolfe turned back to Nina. He held her gaze. I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry, he said. I know. And I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you did. He paused, but I understand enough. Faris arrived in 40 minutes with a portable ultrasound unit, and the brisk efficiency of a man who understood that Wolfe's requests were not actually requests. Nina lay back on the bed in the East Room, wide, quiet, smelling faintly of cedar, while Faris ran the transducer over her stomach with careful, practiced movements. She could feel Wolfe standing at the foot of the bed without looking. He hadn't asked if he could stay. He'd simply stayed. The screen filled with the familiar static that resolved after a moment into the curve of a spine. A shadowed ribcage, a small face in profile, one fist pressed against a cheek. Wolfe's posture changed. Not much, just the shoulders dropping a fraction, like a man setting down something heavy. Heart rate, he asked. Strong, 152. Faris adjusted the wand. Measurements are consistent with 36 weeks. Good size, well positioned. He paused. Mother is malnourished, not critically, but she needs iron and protein. Blood pressure is slightly low. The baby is compensating, taking what it needs. He glanced toward the foot of the bed. Complete rest, no stress. Understood, Wolfe said. Nina stared at the ceiling and did not say anything about that. Sex, Faris asked, looking at her. I don't know yet, she said. I didn't want them to tell me. Wolfe looked at her. She kept her eyes on the ceiling. Leave it, Wolfe said. She was eating the soup Muriel had brought. Thick, simple, exactly what she'd asked for. When he came back from walking Faris out, he stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat on the edge of the window bench across from the bed. The Kenosha shipment, he said. She looked up. It's the last significant move. After Thursday, the distribution channels restructure. It gets quieter on the other side. He said it the way he said everything operational, as information, but she understood what he was actually saying. The specific piece of the machine that had put the device under his car was already gone. The rest was contracting. She set down the soup. I'm not asking you to believe that tonight, he said. Good, because I don't. He almost smiled. Fair. She looked at him across the quiet room. In the lamplight he looked less like what he was, and more like what he might have been if the inheritance had run differently. She'd thought that before, 100 times in 2 years, and it had never made the math simpler. I had the socks with me, she said. He waited. The duck socks. From Michigan Avenue, I took them when I left. She looked down at her hands. I don't know why. I couldn't leave them. She paused. I've been carrying them in the bottom of my bag for 10 months. He was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said finally, just that. She woke at 2 in the morning to a pain that was different. Not the grinding ache in her lower back that had become so routine she'd stopped registering it. This was a seizing, full-body contraction that started in her spine and closed around her abdomen, like something tightening a fist. She sat up, breathed, waited. 3 minutes later, it came again. She was swinging her legs off the bed when the bedroom door opened. Wolfe, without knocking, half-dressed as if he'd been awake for hours. She didn't ask why he was awake. "I think it's starting," she said. He looked at her. "Faris is 20 minutes out." "How do you?" "I called him an hour ago." He crossed the room and put his hand on her back, flat, steady, not asking permission. "When you started shifting in your sleep." She stared at him. "I was watching," he said without apology. She wanted to say something about that. She couldn't find the words because another contraction came in longer this time, and she bent forward and breathed through it with her palms pressed to the mattress, and he kept his hand flat against her back for the entire duration. A constant, grounding pressure. Faris arrived with an assistant. The next 4 hours were the longest of Nina's life. Wolfe did not leave the room. Not once. He stood at the head of the bed, and at some point, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when, somewhere around hour 2 when the contractions were 90 seconds apart, and the room had contracted to nothing but the next breath, she had reached for his hand. She hadn't exactly chosen to, it had just happened, and he had held it without comment, completely still. Steady in the way she had always privately thought was his one irreducible quality. The man was catastrophically flawed in 100 directions, but he did not shake. He did not shake. At 6:17 in the morning, with the lake going pale gold through the bedroom window, their daughter was born. She was small and furious. Her first cry was outraged, as if she had very strong opinions about the timing and the location. Faris placed her on Nina's chest. Nina pressed her lips to the top of the baby's head and couldn't speak. Wolfe sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the baby the way a man looks at something that has arrived without a category. Not in the ledger, not in the org chart, not in any system he had ever built or taken apart. He reached out one finger very carefully. The baby wrapped her hand around it. He went completely still. He sat there with his finger in his daughter's grip, not moving, not speaking, and Nina watched the thing happen that she had spent 10 months being terrified of. His face, entirely open, no architecture, no control, just the raw and irreducible fact of it. "She's strong," Faris said, moving quietly around the periphery. "Good lungs. Color is excellent for a 36-weeker. I want to monitor her for 48 hours, but she looks healthy." He paused. "You both do." Wolfe looked up from the baby. He looked at Nina. She looked back at him, worn down to the cellular level, still holding the warm weight of her daughter against her chest. "I'm not signing the settlement," he said. She blinked. "Wolfe." "Not because I'm refusing to pay you," he said. "Because you're not a contractor anymore, and I need to think carefully about the right structure for this." He held her gaze. His voice was precise, deliberate, and underneath the precision was something that was asking, "Will you give me time to think about the right structure for this?" It was the most careful she had ever heard him ask for anything. She looked down at her daughter. The baby's eyes were closed, her face scrunched and perfect and already, somehow, a little impatient-looking, a quality Nina suspected was not from her side of the equation. "The duck socks are in my bag," she said. He didn't say anything. "If you go get them," she said, "I'll stay a week, and we can talk about the structure." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the chair where she'd left her bag, and came back with the small pair of socks with the yellow ducks on them, soft from 10 months at the bottom of a bag. He set them on the blanket next to the baby's feet. "1 week," he said. She looked at the socks, and at her daughter, and at the man who had held her hand through 4 hours without a single word of complaint, and who was going to be, in all the complicated and difficult ways that mattered, impossible. 1 week, she said, and then we talk about the structure. Outside, the lake had gone from grey to gold.